Hi folks, this week you are reading Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. And this Hemingway is probably one of, if not the most famous American author. He won multiple Pulitzers, he won a Nobel. He is very, very influential in not only the American modernist tradition, but the American canon at large. So his voice within American literature is very pronounced, very well known. Hemingway began his career as a war reporter. He wanted to go serve in World War One and was denied service because of his eyesight, so he joined the Red Cross. He said, "I'm going anyway." And he went over and worked as an ambulance driver. He was injured in a mortar explosion that nearly killed him. And after that, he began his career largely working in war reporting. Now, he's also very influential to the way that war is reported. He generally speaking, portrayed just the objective events without a whole lot of subjective interpretation, without a whole lot of emotion. It was very much just sort of, it's very plain, is what you can describe Hemingway's style as. As a matter of fact, his novel, The Old Man and the Sea, which, is credited with his Nobel, is written at about a 4th to 5th grade reading level. It's not ornate, it's not fancy, it's very, very plain and to the point. Now this became known as his theory of omission, or iceberg theory. And the premise is exactly like the premise of an iceberg, right? In an iceberg, you have a little bit above the surface and everything else, the bulk of the iceberg is beneath the surface. And that's how his stories work. We get a little bit above the surface and everything else is beneath, which makes him a great case study for close reading and for interpretation. Now, Hills Like White Elephants is a great example of iceberg theory. It leaves out a lot of things. It leaves out a lot of context for the relationship, a lot about the characters. We have no insight into their point of view. It's completely third-person objective. It doesn't even actually name the operation that this sort of conversation hinges upon. So after you read this story, we will go deep into how we can use close reading to draw different sorts of conclusions with evidence in the story. However, before you read, there's some things that you need to know to really be able to access the story as effectively as possible. So first of all, they mention an operation. The conversation sort of hinges on this operation that they're talking about, and they're never going to name what that procedure is. The procedure that they're talking about is an abortion. The premise is that Jig, the girl in the story, and the American, who's the man, are in a relationship, and they have found themselves to be pregnant. And they are traveling to Madrid in order to seek termination of that pregnancy. Now, this is an issue and a topic which many people have very charged opinions on, and rightfully so today, one way or the other. Now, it's important, though, to separate your personal sort of perception of that situation from your critical perception of that situation. So in service of a critical perception of the situation, I want to talk a little bit about the historical context of the story so you can understand the situation that they are actually in. So first of all, the story is set in the 1920s. It was first published in 1927, and it was part of Hemingway's collection called Men Without Women. Do with that what you will. But at this period of time, a pregnancy, or the consideration to terminate a pregnancy, came with a lot of other social factors that are not really congruent with that decision today. So first of all, we understand that this couple is unmarried. And for Jig, the girl, to be an unmarried pregnant woman is highly controversial, socially speaking. She would likely be socially ostracized if she were to be found out. Now, if she were to go through with having the baby, she has a couple of options. First of all, the American can marry her. Second of all, if the American leaves her, which he would have no obligation to do otherwise, I mean, he absolutely could, with no social consequences to himself, then she is left in sort of a bad situation as well. In the 1920s, she would have very little way to support herself and her child. She's in a country that she doesn't understand the language. We understand her to be fairly young, fairly naive. And she would likely end up in like a home for unwed mothers. And while that might sound nice, these places were generally institutions that tried to coerce or convince young, poor, pregnant girls to give their children to better parents. So not a great situation for her there. On the other hand, if she goes through with the termination, the procedure that she's facing is, again, comes with a lot of different circumstances than she would face today. Number one, it's illegal. They're in Spain, which is a highly Catholic country. It was illegal in the U.S. at this time too, but there are legal repercussions. She's going to seek an illegal procedure in a country where it is very morally frowned upon, perhaps even more so than in other parts of the world. Not only that, it's a very dangerous procedure. She would likely not be receiving this procedure from a doctor. And around this period of time, about 1 in 4 women would suffer dire, if not fatal, consequences because of infection and other various things that happen from receiving a legal abortion. So that's a very scary predicament to be in as well. So when Jig's looking at the situation, her only sort of promising option is for the American to marry her and settle down and start a family. Now, with that in mind, you want to think about whether her partner, the American or the man in the story, what his inclination towards that is. Now, an important thing to keep in mind in this story is that a major aspect of stories about relationships is communication. I would urge caution at accepting what either one of these characters say at face value. So although the American may suggest that, he's perfectly willing to go through with it, you want to think about what that actually means. The difference between I'm willing to do it versus I want to do it, right? So think about those sorts of things as you're reading the story. Another thing that I will just touch on as a minor note, they are drinking beer in the story, and sometimes, people, because she's pregnant, people see that they're drinking beer and they're like, oh, well, this must be related to her abortion. In the 1920s, they had no idea that drinking beer was bad for a pregnancy. We didn't discover that until like the 1970s. So that's something to keep in mind as well. As you're reading the story, again, remember, we're reading beneath the surface. See what different sort of ideas you can come up with about what's going on. And then in lieu of an analysis video following the story, you will practice close reading in a video note set following.